In our last video, we went over our most recent race in this car and talked about kind of our shortcomings when we ended up spinning around and getting that bit of a vibration towards the end of the feature. Unfortunately, obviously, we didn't finish our feature, and that was just from us missing what we needed to do during our breaks in between sessions. So obviously that costed us the race, but this week I want to go over what we're going to do to hopefully alleviate that in the future and have that never happen again. Now, one thing we've already done to hopefully take care of this issue was we ended up taking our drive shaft here to get rebalanced. We pulled the whole drive shaft out, took it to a local shop here in Colorado Springs, and just had them balance it for us, make sure that we're phased correctly, make sure everything was straight on it. We also added these 12-point bolts on the front adapter with some new lock washers. And our rear bolts seem pretty good still. The threads are still good on them. The nylock nuts still lock pretty heavily. And we actually didn't have an issue with the rear at all. It seems like it's mostly coming from the front end. So hopefully that'll solve our issue. We need to fix our rear end back there a little bit because it seems like our motor may have shifted. We may have to loosen up our motor mount bolts as well on the right side and just try and scoot the motor forward a little bit, or even tighten up these bolts right here on this side of the motor mount. It does look like it's a little bit off because our Zerk fitting right there is pretty close to hitting the firewall when it rotates. So we're gonna try and hopefully get our drive shaft over a tiny bit more, fix our offset a little bit. Obviously, we're gonna go through the rear end and replace all of our lollipop bolts again because we ended up spinning out during that second practice. But one thing I'm gonna do to make sure that this bolt right here on the rear end never comes off is just put a little bit of a longer bolt through it and put a nylock nut on the end of it. So obviously people have been putting those nylock nuts on the opposite end of their bolts for a long time. I know a handful of cars do that at CNS as well. Unfortunately, with this being our first year, we don't know a lot of these simple fixes for a lot of things. So we're trying our best to keep up with everything, and obviously when we make mistakes, we'll learn from them and hopefully continue on racing without destroying our car. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. Obviously we have our bolt on the left side going to our lollipop on the rear end, and then we have a little nylock nut on there on the other side just to keep the bolt from backing out whenever it hits a little bit of a vibration. So we're gonna go ahead and do that with all of our lollipop bolts on the chassis as well, including our panhard bar and both of the rear trailing arms. We'll also go through and do that on these front ones as well, just to make sure that we're consistent throughout the chassis and that nothing is different. As of right now, that's the only issue that we see really a big deal. We're gonna try and tighten up our steering rack, hopefully to get rid of a little bit of the slop that we've been having. But other than that, I think that a majority of our vibrations are fixed. Now we just kind of gotta go through, nut and bolt check the car again, make sure everything on the inside of the cockpit is still good, and hopefully we'll be ready to race for our next event in September. And now that we're looking at our right rear trailing arm here, you can see we've just thrown that nylock nut on there to hopefully give us a little bit of a better chance at retaining our bolts. And it is slightly longer. I think it's a 2-inch threaded bolt. So hopefully that'll keep us from losing our bolts altogether. We still got to go through and do the fronts, but the hardware store closest to us didn't have all of the grade 5 that we needed. So we're just doing these, and now all we got to do is throw on one of our spare bumpers since we lost one during our last race, and throw our practice set of tires back on the car so we're not rolling around on our race set. Now we don't actually do anything specific in terms of tire prep for our race wheels versus our practice set. Really, we just take them off so that the car isn't sitting on the race set that we like to use, since These are sticker tires from the beginning of the year. These ones, I believe, have quite a bit of life gone from them. They've been used for many, many laps. And we just kind of picked them up from someone who was gracious enough to allow us to purchase them off of them for relatively cheap. But I mean, all we do for our race set is just get all the excess dirt off. We just kind of knock off all the rocks and whatnot and get it relatively clean. But we don't sit here with any type of prep or a DA sander or anything like that to really get rid of any of the impurities in the rubber. We don't try and create a new surface on these at all. We just want to keep the car off of them whenever the car just kind of sits around and does nothing for a couple weeks. I've been told that these tires last a long, long time, and I have no problem believing that. I know it was a bit controversial when US Legend cars ended up switching from Federals to Hoosiers and then not being able to supply the tires that they needed, but we're lucky enough to have a dealer that seems to be able to keep relatively decent stock. And so we've got another stack right there of stickers, deciding whether or not to put them on the car now and try and race out the rest of the season with them, or keep them in some plastic bags in the basement and just throw them on for next year. I'm really hoping that our only issue from the vibration was that the drive shaft bolt started to back out, and I'm hoping that it was only caused by us spinning around. So ideally, we're gonna keep that in mind for the next time we do, and hopefully we can stay on top of it and have that never happen again. We're gonna try and be more cognizant about what we do in between sessions, making sure all of our nuts and bolts are checked again. We already do a full nut and bolt check before we go out every weekend, but now it's probably gonna be in the back of my mind, so we're probably gonna do it in between qualifying and the dashes and practices and whatnot. So hopefully we're still able to stay on top of it, especially for the drive shaft and the suspension components in the rear. We also ended up taking our drive shaft up to a shop and getting it balanced, so hopefully that's not an issue that we didn't realize and was also potentially getting the bolts to back out. So other than that, I've got nothing else for you today, so I appreciate you guys watching and I hope to catch you in the next one.